This event took place at Wimbledon Book Fest 2024.
It's incredibly nice to be here in Wimbledon Library. I only became aware that I'd be part of this fantastic event about 5 or 6 weeks ago when I woke up one morning, went through my usual practice, checked my emails, and there was one from the folks from the Wimbledon Book Festival. Would I like to come to the Wimbledon Library and do a conversation with Colm Tóibín? It's one of those emails that is almost unbelievable. You can't imagine you've been asked to engage. I'm being totally honest about that because, no, it's true. So these are my original versions bought in 2009 and 2024 because I think I've now learnt why I'm here. I'd been to another book talk somewhere, I think with Alif Shafiq, and had said, I'm just reading this incredible book. It is so good that I've started to ration it as I get towards the end because I can't bear for it to finish. So we don't know each other that well. We've met a couple of times. In 2015, we shared a producer for 2 different films. And for my film, which was a documentary, and I'll never forget this, we sat watching it, and I sat next to Colm, and every time there was a tense moment in the film, he'd grab my hand and say, "Oh my God, this is so tense." And I just thought, what an incredibly lovely person. At that point, I'd read some of the works. We're focusing today on these 2 extraordinary books, both of them rather different in a certain way, but connected. And we're going to proceed on the basis that most of you here have read one or more likely both books. So we're going to proceed on a reasonably high level of knowledge of the main characters and the main issues. But can we actually go back to the beginning, the birth of Brooklyn? What caused you to open that door? It was connected to other books that you've written, and there'll be a familiarity. But what were the catalysts?
I suppose there were 2 things. One, that my father died in the summer of 1967. And from that time, like July, until the end of the year of 1967. So I'm 12. Small town, southeast of Ireland. People would just come to the house. And it's almost a ritual where if someone came, they would say something to my mother first about my father, about how sorry they were for her trouble or something, some almost formula of words. And then they would sit down. And in general, there wouldn't be alcohol served, but it would just be people just talk. And towards the end of that particular period, my job was to answer the door. And if we needed to take coats and sort of lead them into the back room, and where my mother was. And one evening, this woman came. And it was towards the end of that period. She'd never been in our house before. And at the beginning, I don't think there was anyone else there except her and my mother. I certainly answered the door to her. I knew who she was. And let her in, and she was a widow, and I knew she lived in Court Street, and she talked, and she had letters from her daughter, who my mother would have known, who lived in Brooklyn. It wasn't America, it wasn't Manhattan, it wasn't New York, it was Brooklyn, and were there letters to show in Brooklyn? Now, either someone spoke about her when she left, which was often the most interesting part of these evenings, where somebody would be foolish enough to go. And some would say, well, did you hear what she said? Or, and so at some point, but it was mentioned a few times that this daughter of hers had come home once from America, but had taken her ring off on the boat or on the boat. And because she knew that if she came home married, that they would immediately know she would soon go back and they would lose her, as it were, that she would be gone. And my mother would say, that fellow in New York was so crazy about her that he wouldn't let her go home until she married him. And that became something in my mind, stayed there. I knew nothing else about her. And I didn't know what time of the year she came back. I didn't know how long she stayed. I didn't know who she was married to in New York. And I had nothing else at all other than, and so when the book came out, I was in New York and I was signing books. And one evening, a woman came to get the book signed with someone behind her who I thought must have been her son. He was a tall young fellow, and the woman looked at me, got the book signed. She just said very quietly, "I think that's my mother." And I said, "You mean your mother married an Italian?" And she said, "No, but I do think it's my mother." And I said something about, "Where was your mother from?" "Oh, where you're from, Enniscorthy." And I said, "What was your mother's name?" And she said a name, and I said, "What else could I say?" "Oh, that's your mother." And then she said, "Why did you make him Italian?" I said, "Well, I had nothing. I just had tiny thing," meaning that in that family of hers in America, that story of her mother coming home to Ireland and taking off the ring, and that must have been known as a story. So therefore, it all made sense. The part of the town, the year in question, I suppose all those things. But anyway, she was very nice about it, and we cut then to those years later when our mutual friend Finola Dwyer produced a film of Brooklyn, and they didn't have a cinema in Enniscorthy. It had closed, so they built a sort of cinema in the ballroom of the hotel, and there were 2 screenings of the film. And I have to say, we looked much better, all of us, than the Oscar people. I mean, better clothes, better hairdos, just better attitude. And among the people there to see the film were this woman and her sister. So in other words, if you just think of that complete round story of someone emigrating and all these things happening to do with books and films afterwards. So that's the first story, the part of the story. For a novel before this, a novel called Nora Webster, I needed to give an account of what it was like for people to visit the house in these months after my father died. And I put in a tiny story of a woman coming up and showing letters about her daughter in Brooklyn. And I think it's on page 3. It's still there in the book. And I had written the first chapter of that book, which had that story in it. And I then got an invite. You know that business of opening emails in the morning and you get an invite to Texas. Well, I've never been there. And then you get an invite, like it's for 3 months, semester at a university, very light work, nice money. And it's just, and you just reply without thinking. You get a Chardonnay rush with no Chardonnay, and you go, "Yeah, that sounds great." And you end up there. You think, what am I going to do? And it might be that you're so far from the sea, but whatever it was, and it might also be that, Texas will be lovely when they finish it. But certainly, I longed to go home when I woke up in the morning. I missed things I don't even like, Irish food and Irish news. And so when I came home, I decided I should get back to work. I read the first chapter of this novel I was working on. I found that story in page 3. And whatever emotions had been going on, whatever churning up of things had been going on for me, I thought, that story, little paragraph, 4 sentences, is enough for something. But I thought it might be a novella, or a short story. I didn't plan it to be a full book, but I just thought I should work on it. And so I stopped working on that novel. I wrote, and I started writing the novel that became Brooklyn. Really from, from all that stuff about myself having been involved in that. So that was really I suppose, the genesis that I'm aware of. But you can often find that there are things underneath that you don't really even yourself understand as to how something started.
2 more things to love about Colm Tóibín. One is when you're in conversation with him for an hour, you only have to ask one question. And secondly, and I noticed this just in reading some of the interviews, someone puts a brilliant question to you. And remember, I'm a barrister, so I'm attentive to these things. You don't actually answer the question, which is heaven. You did answer that question, but...
Yeah, but I'm planning not to answer other ones.
No, but you didn't...
So barrister, go ahead.
The lovely boy who saw you in that line, who said to you, "Why did you make him Italian?" That's sort of interesting too. I mean, you would have had a range of options. Could have been from Iowa, could have been a Jewish guy, could have been a black guy. Italian.
Okay. I decided to do some research. And so there's a book called An Oral History of Brooklyn in the 1950s. And it's really pretty good stuff about, but one stage of the interview, they're interviewing a lot of ordinary people who lived in Brooklyn in these years. And at one stage of the interview, an Italian guy who just says, during those years, he's talking about being, say, 20 in 1950, all of us wanted Irish girlfriends. And honestly, I thought, well, surely that's a mistake. It should be Icelandic or some other, And I realized, of course, the project after the Second World War is to move away from your ethnic origin to become an American. Secondly, the Irish girl will most likely be white, English-speaking, and Catholic. So you're moving out of your comfort zone as an Italian, but not that much. But I have to also say that if it had been known in Ireland that there was such demand for Irish girls by Italians, I mean, there would have been, honestly, a rush out of the country from which we would never have recovered. But so I realized that I could work with that idea of him being an Italian in a way that if he's Jewish, I have to really start working at the ways in which, what would it mean in this year for an Irish girl to marry a Jewish guy, and certainly if he's African American, that would further make the story, the ethnic story of two races, rather than the story I wanted, which was to be her story.
I mean, this is especially interesting for me because, as you know, I have an interest on the individual and the group. Crimes against humanity, the protection of the individual; genocide, the protection of the group. And one of the ways of reading both these books, certainly one of the ways I read this book, is this extraordinary unstated tension that is there between an individual, Eilish, who is caught between two lives. It emerges, it's in Brooklyn, but it comes back with force in Long Island, in which the question of your identity and your connections and your preferences and your sense of belonging to a particular group comes into play. Were you consciously or subconsciously teasing out, because you've sort of alluded it now in what you've just said about the relationship between different groups. It's in all of what we do. Everyone in this room will understand what it is that I'm saying. Who are we? Are we individuals? Are we members of a group? Of course, the answer is we're both, but it's complex. And if we have to choose between one group, our family, half Italian now in the case of Long Island, or our family at home, wholly Irish, what do we do? You obviously have reflected a lot on those issues. What's your sense now as someone like me raises these questions? Is it explicit? Is it subconscious? Is it an issue you're interested in?
I think you're constantly alert in New York to the Irish and to what it means. I was in the choir of my local Catholic church when I lived on the Upper West Side first, which was in the year 2000. And I mean, being in the choir, I have to say that she told me I was to stop this Irish tenor nonsense. I was a bass, and the other bass was a really good singer, so I could just follow him. It was fine. Peter was his name, and he was just great. Until one day he decided just to pretend he had to leave early and stand at the back watching me trying to do it on my own. But of course, the women, a lot of the women were from the Caribbean, and a lot of the women had been singing in churches all their lives, and to watch them move from being reasonably poor people coming in often from housing projects, oddly enough still on the Upper West Side, and showing us what this would mean. But the church was Irish, meaning it was, I think, built by Irish people. All the plaques, all this paraphernalia had Irish names. It was filled with Murphys and McCanns. And one evening we had to do the rehearsals in the parish, where the parish priest lived, meaning in the manse or in the priest's house. And there was I suppose a Hispanic priest there. And I said to him, what happened to all the Irish? All the names. And he just looked at me and said, yeah, they went out to the island, meaning Long Island. And meaning, they all moved. That you wouldn't find it very hard to find any Irish group around the Upper West Side of New York now, but there was once a time when you would. And sometimes you come right up against it. In Boston, you really are aware still how close the Irish are. What's strange now is that some of the Irish have moved over, and they're very, you see, Donald Trump, there are certain groups he can't have near him. He can't really have WASPs, I mean, serious rich American Protestants near him, because it might be better than him in his estimation. He can't have African Americans because he's a racist. He can't have Jewish people for the same reasons, more or less. So who can he have? He has surrounded by the Irish. Steve Bannon, just go through all the names of all the people around him. Oh, they're all the Irish have moved in because, of course, he can despise them and need them. And, of course, some of them are just... Anyway, just to go back to your question, the idea, you see, if she's a young man and goes to Brooklyn, she moves into her, I suppose, her comfort group very quickly. It's sport, it's a bar, it's a workplace, it's a group of men wandering around. But if she's a woman on her own, then she doesn't own the street. She doesn't have a pub or a place like that to go to. Sport is not going to matter that much. So the domestic space, her room, her private space, and her own privacy is going to matter to her much more. So she's not going to get involved with America in any sense, and she's certainly not going to get involved in Irish America. So I wanted her out of all that easy drama of Irish people in America or people emigrating to America. And so, yeah, I am aware very much of trying to keep her out of that easy drama of emigration, of losing your country. She doesn't really think like that.
You also have, since we're talking about her now, I think for many readers, but particularly female readers, and I've talked about this with a number of friends and family who are women, a facility or an ability to write about women. Women occupy, I have a sense, a singular and particular place in your scheme of things. Where does that come from? You alluded to it at childhood, the loss of your father, your mum, the way you talked about her. And incidentally, the way you write about mothers is fascinating. I mean, Eilish's mother, Tony's mother, of a different background. How your relationship with women in how you write, where does that come from, and what challenges does it pose for you?
I think it doesn't come from any sort of generic sense of women as much as my mother had two younger sisters who didn't marry until later. My father had a sister who never married, and they were living very close to us, so that it wouldn't just be Christmas. It would be all week, really. One or the other would be around. And my two nearest siblings were girls as well, so that you could find yourself as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old on a Sunday afternoon in the winter, trying to get upstairs quickly so no one would notice you, to see if you could get into my parents' bedroom, where my mother, her two sisters, maybe my father's sister, maybe my own sisters, maybe somebody else, that all of them had gathered. And they'd often just talk about clothes. A coat that Auntie Harriet almost bought in Cleary's at the sale in Dublin, but it was the buttons. And the other hand would say, but what was it in the buttons? And then my mother would say, well, green doesn't suit you at all. I don't think you should have bought that coat at all. And I would say, does green not suit me? I'd say, no. And he said, oh, someone said, I you have a green cardigan. I like that. And yeah, I'd be going, oh my God, someone's going to say next? Some of it was code, but some of it wasn't. Some of it was just, they were absolutely fascinated by a coat that Auntie Harriet nearly bought. And then I would go downstairs and I would find that my father and his brother and my own older brother and some other fellow would be sitting there mournfully. And two of the men could be smoking those wonderful ways men smoked, and one of them could, honestly, I mean, this would be, first of all, they'd say nothing for ages, and then one of them would say, that second goal that young McCarthy scored on Sunday, I thought that was a good goal. And then my father could say, and I could say, this has to stop. And then someone else would say, yeah, but there was another goal that was scored. I thought there was nearly a goal, there was nearly a goal that would have been a better goal if it had been... And they'd say, yeah, you're right about that. That was a good goal if it had been scored. And I would just sit there as a 6-year-old thinking, this has to end. And so you go back upstairs again. So this novel, Brooklyn, was written when those women were the older generation had just died. So there was a whole sense of, that's all disappeared. And it isn't about any generic idea of women. It's about, this is imagining Brooklyn, that my Auntie Harriet, my mother's younger sister, had gone to America. Now, there are details in it that you'd have to be, me to recognize, which is that it mentions where she works in the novel, where her sister Rose works. Well, that's where my two aunts worked, S&A.G. Davis and Enniscorthy. And it was a mill, and it was the office of the mill they worked in. You were automatically a member of the 9-hole golf club if you worked in the office. Mr. Brown, the old patrician boss, ordained this. So they're playing golf was absolutely part of the deal almost. And so I'm imagining that she went to America, the younger one. And I'm imagining her, what she would do, where she would go, the sort of letter she would write home. So in other words, it's emphatically out of life rather than out of some other idea that I understand women. That just seems to me against all the principles of novel writing, which is you don't understand anything.
You describe it as Irish, generically Irish, I think you said just now. But one other aspect of both these novels is that they have a universal feel to them. I've seen people reading these novels in many different countries. They touch people, obviously, in different ways, in different communities. That would not have been conscious as you were writing it. You're drawing from your own experiences. But at what point did you, if at all, develop a sense that the themes, the style, the tone, the understatement was reaching an audience that went way beyond the community of people living in Brooklyn or in Ireland? It's a global reach that you've had. How does one explain that certain books have that consequence?
There was something else going on at the time I wrote this book, which was that Ireland, in the first time in its history, I mean, if you forget the English arriving or the Danes arriving or the Vikings or the Normans, that there was the first time in its history that people were coming into Ireland seeking work and seeking a better life. And it was a big bit of a shock for the society. But it was even a bigger shock for me because I presumed that people would be automatically more welcome because of our huge history at going everywhere we wanted to go and expecting a welcome. And therefore, when it began to be feeling that, for example, you probably know this, that there was a referendum at one point around this sort of time which removed the idea that if you were born in Ireland, you would not automatically be an Irish citizen according now to the Constitution. Now, I got pretty fired up about this idea. Hold on now, that these Chinese friends of mine had a baby. Now, what is that baby a citizen of on day one? The baby has never been in China. The baby was born in Ireland. Like, what? How are you going to prove this baby is not Irish? But actually, it's in the Constitution. Now, I got fired up about any effort to say that someone in Nigeria... I loved Dublin becoming a sort of vaguely cosmopolitan city, where we started to eat one another's food. In other words, that you would have not only Italian restaurants and Chinese restaurants, but places where Nigerians gathered to eat and Nigerian cooking. And Polish, God, when the Poles arrived, it was so exciting. And so I just, there were two moments, I think. One is where I read something James Baldwin said, don't think that African Americans don't matter in your life because we'll be there when you're being born. We're always around the hospital. We're always cleaning the hospital. We're always everywhere. And when you're dying, don't think we won't be the person who's making the bed or in the room. We'll be there for all that in your white life. And so I realized that when one of my aunts was very sick, all night I watched the Lithuanian. She wasn't even a nurse. She was just there all night, making sure everything was okay. I noticed in the supermarket, again, Lithuanians, and feeling actually something about their loneliness has to hit a spot. And it's hitting it in me, but I don't think it's hitting a spot in general in the society. And that was there in me as I was writing the book. It may be one of the things that I wasn't conscious of, but it certainly mattered enormously to me in those particular years, that this image of what it's like to go to another country on your own and try and make your way, it needs to be has to be dramatized. It has to be really driven home.
So one of the things I only learned about Colm this evening was that in 1985, as a young rookie journalist working in Argentina, he covered the trial of the generals. I should have known, I had no idea, but you obviously, at an early stage in life, began to wander, and that presumably also is connected to your ability to sense how other communities see things, do things, smell things, live things. Where did that wandering sense
I suppose the homesickness is funny. It's never stable, and it can disappear, and it can not be there, and it can come in a single second where you feel, particularly about Ireland, because it can come in a bit of music. Say, oh my God. Or it could come in I'm not making this up. Just seeing another Irish person on the street in some funny country and looking at, where are you from? And immediately your voice and your accent could change. I mean, this was the most unfortunate version of this, is that I was in Egypt and I met this really, really nice English couple from some really nice part of London. And they said to me, look, when you're coming back through London, do come and stay with us. And it was all wonderful. It was one of those nice places. Give me those names, Hampstead, Chelsea, all those places. And their house was really nice. And it was all great until a woman appeared at the doorway, and she was Irish, and she was their maid. And the minute she looked at me, I looked at her, we went, the face changes, the voice changes, the accent changes. And so she said to me, I said to her, so where are you from? You're from Clonmel. Oh, do you know Tommy O'Brien? She said, I'm literally Tommy O'Brien. And she said, yeah, do you know him? I said, yeah. I heard. I said, where are you? In Escorthy. Oh, in Escorthy. And do you ever... And afterwards, the couple said, do you know what you did when she appeared? I said, I just talked to her. She said, no. Your accent changed. Your face changed. Everything about you changed. The way you talked to us and the way you spoke to her. And I said, do you not do that all the time? They said, no. And but it's that idea. It happens. It's a big. Everyone knows this one. Where if you're Irish, I don't think it happens to English people when you're in New York and you go to you're at the airport, JFK, and you see a British Airways, air hostess or a cabin crew. You see a British Airways logo, and you go, I'm home. I don't think that happens here, but it happens to us where you go to JFK and you suddenly see the Irish in the part of JFK, at the moment it's Terminal 7, where you suddenly see all the Irish sitting. And the one thing you notice is no one looks as though they own the place. And if they're pushing things along, they're always sort of looking out. And the man could be more frightened looking than the woman. But it's not that they're frightened looking, it's just that there's something in the face that you realize, God, and you feel immediately some funny sense of home. By the way, that can dissolve very quickly when you get home. I mean, you could want to be away again very soon. But and the minute the air hostess says to you, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like another cup of tea? And by the way, you get very fed up with this when you get home. But just for those hours, it's that whole idea of you've been away and now you're home. And home is a funny cocoon. It's filled with familiar sounds and recognizable statements. And so you move back and forth between being utterly comfortable away and then having funny feelings of belonging to a place, that it's very hard in that context to become an American.
So on the subject of frightened Irishmen pushing trolleys in JFK, let's talk about Jim. Lovely Jim. You've told us a little bit about the genesis of Eilish. What about Jim?
It was on my mind that, every Irish film you see, every Irish play, and most Irish novels have an alarming Irishman who is either too charming to be real or too drunk or unreliable, really attractive in some funny way, ready to do, or brooding, dark, deep depressions in the winter. And you think of the Irish actors, that all of them are ready to play this. From, Gabriel Byrne, you just think of all of them. Are they cutting those fingers off and stuff? Are there IRA men? Oh, IRA men, they're going to blow you up. And I thought, would it be possible to break this. Of course, it's broken by James Joyce in Ulysses and in The Dead, where these strange, slightly haunted Irishmen like Leopold Bloom or Gabriel Conroy emerge as just thoughtful, quite silent, but with a lot of sensuality. I thought, is it possible I could make one of these? And then what happened was that in the film of Brooklyn, I saw the film a good number of times, and in a short period of time, and I became interested in the character of Jim, as played by the Irish actor Donald Gleeson. That's Domhnail. And I wrote to him when I saw the film to say, you've done the hardest thing, which is to make a stable Irishman, to make someone who's just decent, who's tolerant, whose emotions are held within, but not held too tight. And I got a lot from watching him. We were talking earlier about there's a moment where he comes to the director and the screenwriter is Nick Hornby as an actor to say, I need one more scene, which of course every actor, Meryl Streep always wants, everyone wants one more scene. But he did really mean what he said, because he needed a scene where he could be shown, where he could be seen, where he could be understood. And it's a scene where, in the film, where he's having dinner with her. I think he's wearing a tie. And he starts to talk about, I've never been anywhere. I'd love to go to Rome, and I'd love to go to Paris. He just talks about himself for a bit and then apologizes. And I got a lot from that, of just seeing how I could work with him again, not the actor, but the character. But there's also, it's very hard sometimes to understand where things come from, because in that initial encounter I described of the woman whose mother said, this is, the book is based on my mother. Behind her was standing her tall son, sort of looking at me. He was about 20 years old, and he just said to me when his mother had, we'd gone through the whole thing, I don't like this book. And he said, he laughed and said, Enniscorthy, I've been in Enniscorthy, because that's where my mum's from, and my grandmother's from there. And there are a lot of bars in the town. They're really nice bars. You don't mention them. I think there should be more about bars in your book. And he was really funny, But it's possible that remark on its own was enough to give me, I need more about bars.
What is so fascinating here? I mean, I write non-fiction. It's very different. You're a novelist. In fact, you write also some non-fiction. But the way in which real life experiences, whether it's as a 6-year-old or doing a book signing somewhere in the United States, a moment will happen which will have a catalytic effect. Will create an idea. The idea will stay in your mind. It won't get lost, and you'll feel the need to come back to it. Yeah. Has it always been like that for you in writing?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you don't know where something comes from. And then often at the end of a book, you realize that the shape of a book came so close from something that happened or something imagined that if you'd known, if you'd been conscious of it, you wouldn't have done it. But sometimes it's the opposite, where, about 20 years ago, maybe even more, I got invited to a rave. R-A-V-E. Now, I know this sounds absurd, but honestly, someone a bit younger than me said, look, we're all going, why don't you come? And luckily I didn't. I knew not to go. I knew, don't. There's a middle-aged man at a rave is not a good look. And but I wrote a story later on about a rave and someone taking a lot of drugs. And I've never done that. And I've never been at a rave. And but not being at that rave gave me a story about being at a rave, So you can never be sure where anything is coming from. But the exile, and I never, I've never really been a big Irish American, even though I live a lot in America. I live most of the year now in America. I don't go to Irish events generally. I went to one football match, Gaelic football, but I wasn't sure that it was for me, and I don't. So it's not my world really. But suddenly I realized it was. I mean that it was my world. So
and writing about something that you haven't actually experienced, like a rave, R-A-V-E. I was, as you spelt it out, I was thinking, how else could you spell that?
Well, it's just that it would seem so incredible that people might think it was some other word I'd said, because what would I be doing?
How did that story go down? Authentic?
Look,
resonant?
Somebody asked me on the street, did you really take all those drugs?
Yeah. We're reaching the point now where we're going to open it up. This lovely audience, I know, will have a lot of questions. I've got 14,000 more questions, but I'm going to ask that the lights come up because I've just seen there's just a lot of energy from a lot of happy readers here. And let's just start with a question here on the left. And other people start putting your hands up so that I can just see them coming. But if we could just begin with there's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you.
You've got to hold it very close to your mouth.
All right, can you hear me? First of all, I am so delighted to meet you tonight, Colm, because you and I were born in the same month, in the same year. And ever since I've read The South, I have just followed your writing and I'm addicted, totally seduced by it. But I also read, I know we've not to divert from Brooklyn, but I also read a very interesting essay written by Roland Barthes on the death of the author. And I was thinking today as I was coming up here that you slip so seamlessly and effortlessly between fiction and biography. My first book after The South was Nora Webster. Given that essay, how on earth do you manage, given what Philippe's talking about tonight, where does it come from in terms of, do you believe in the death of the author and it doesn't come from experience? Because you're writing also about, other famous people. How on earth does that work? And I can say whatever you write works beautifully, whether it's fiction or whether it's The Master, which, if anybody in this room hasn't read The Master, please read The Master. What a beautiful exposition of what Henry James really was and what he really meant to people who were interested in good literature. And thank you very much. I hope it's not I didn't know how to phrase this, but do you get the gist of the question?
Sure. I think the Roland Barthes essay, it was really about the idea that the text has an autonomy. You can't keep saying, what was the author's intention? And so in order to read a short story, do I need to know what was behind it, that the text itself has a life? But he himself wrote a wonderful morning diary about his mother, which is clearly personal, his, and so I think the issue is that each time you start tentatively. You don't know what you're doing. And so that it was on my mind all the years that, that idea of being a 12-year-old I've described in that house, that there was something I could do with that I could work using a lot of, sometimes the death of the author, you use the strangest small things. There was one period in that house where my mother, a thing happened with pensions, which they got better. She bought a little stereo and she started to put on this Beethoven Archduke trio, played by Jacqueline Dupre, Daniel Barenboim, and Pinchas Zuckerman. And it went on a lot. And if you're 12 and 13, there's nothing worse. I mean, classical music is bad, but chamber music is much worse. And but I found that I could find that actual same cover, it was an LP. So just by working with small things like that from memory, I could build a novel. And but you start each time not knowing, and things don't work for a while, and it really is a very tentative process. But I don't know the death of the author. I mean, you're just, that's an interesting question, because sometimes you don't understand if the next page is something you've decided on. It said, instead of Monday, I'm going to make it Wednesday. And that's me deciding. And then you realize, no, you're missing the point. It's Enniscorthy. You're back in Enniscorthy. Or an Australian woman said to me, how many people die in this book? Oh my God, quite a lot. So, you just can't win.
At the back on the right-hand side over there, if we could.
Hi, Colm. My name's Anna. First of all, I want to thank you for writing the book Brooklyn and Long Island. They really bring to life my own mother's journey. She left Roscommon in the early 1960s to go and travel to New York and live in Brooklyn. where she eventually married my father, who actually was from Cavan and happened to be living there too. So I think for me, it really brings to life those experiences in a way that I have not seen in other novels and in other literature. So thank you very much. What I'd like to ask you is, if you had to pick a favourite character out of all of your books, who would it be?
I suppose that there's a short story called A Long Winter. It's at the end of the book called Mothers and Sons. I think the protagonist, the young fellow in that, it's set in Spain, I think he would be the nearest. Yeah.
Down here on the right, please. Hang on, there's a microphone because people at the back will want to hear.
I have a question which I really hope you can answer. I'm a new writer, and I think I became a writer for a number of reasons, but I know one of them was from reading your work for many, many years. I taught English literature for 40 years, and then I felt it was time for me to write. But I heard you do a talk, and you were sitting in front of 2 Frank Auerbach drawings. I don't know if you remember that. And you didn't want to really go, but you spent some hours in front of these 2, and I know those drawings because I had met Frank Auerbach, and on many occasions. And I just, you talk a lot about not knowing necessarily where a book's going to go, but having an idea and then developing that idea, and how tentative it can be. And I wondered whether, looking at those 2 drawings, whether those inspired an idea of some kind, because you clearly were completely taken with them, like I was. I mean, I have seen those drawings many times and talked to Frank Auerbach about them.
I mean, what happened was that the painter Frank Auerbach was having a show, and someone asked me to write something for the catalogue, and it's the most daunting prospect because it's such a body of work. But these were self-portrait. One of them in particular was a self-portrait in charcoal, with bits of chalk, but mainly charcoal. Done. Let me think. He's born in 1931, so this will be done in 1957, 58. And all I said was, Could you find a place where this drawing is and put me in a room with it and leave me alone for 3 hours? And this was done. But the 3 hours you have to do is you have to take notes all the time. You have to work all the time. There's no point in sitting there staring at the painting thinking there's some spiritual connection between you and it. You have to work. And the work is to try and describe every single mark, not psychological, not I feel the spirit of something. No. How is the eye done? What smudge? Is that smudge, or is it a piece of chalk added? He worked so hard that the paper gets cut and he has to repair it, so there's an under paper. Anyway, I just did that for 3 hours and I came away. Yeah, in a way you have to sometimes concentrate fiercely, and it may be on getting a landscape in a character, getting a piece of dialogue. You have to go and think really hard to think, is there some thing I'm not describing here? Is there something I'm not getting right? Where did the light fall? Am I using the word light fall? It's a stupid thing. Where did the light fall? Shut up. Stop talking nonsense. Give me one thing. Give me a detail. Give me a thing. Stop giving me thoughts. Give me things. So you go with, what is the thing I can now use for this? And, at the moment I have a 15-year-old trying to get into going to a school for the first time, and it's a school that's known for hurling, meaning it's just like hockey, it's Irish sport. But he's stupidly brought a tennis racket in an old press. Do you remember when they were wooden and they had to be locked into a press? And he's so conscious that it's lying there, and everyone's looking. He thinks they're not, but he thinks they're looking at his tennis racket in its press, which puts him, out of. You have to keep. Is there one object? Is there one thing I can work with? I don't want it to have symbolic value. I want it to be there as a real thing in the picture. And so working on that day on that was just to see, was there, like, how do you make a nose? What's that big line he does? The risks he's taking. So, I spent my,
This resonates for me on coming back to the earlier question on your work as a novelist of fiction. How does it work in relation to non-fiction? I think that was the subtext of your question, because I'm thinking about the book about Thomas Mann, and I'm imagining in your answer to the last question, you're writing Brooklyn or Long Island, or maybe the one that may follow, set in the 1990s, that there would be those moments. How does it work for non-fiction?
Well, I don't think of the Henry James novel, The Master or The Magician, as being non-fiction. In other words, they really are an attempt to create an illusion. But there's a pact with the reader, which is that if I say, the big one actually is, Thomas Mann had 6 children. Now, think of a novel, just think of King Lear had 3. Hamlet is like Ophelia. Like, there are a lot of only children in literature for really good reasons. And it's very hard to handle a big family because you have to keep remembering, where's Michael? I haven't mentioned him for 2 chapters. Jeez, I better put in something about Michael. Monica is completely missing. And if you add it gratuitously, it looks like that. So he had 6 children. And my problem is, can it be 4? And the answer is no. No, it can't. In other words, the pact with the reader is, if I say he was in Munich in a certain year, he was. When he went to Princeton, he did. Now, that's the basic thing. It's the same with Henry James. Did he move into Lamb House in Rye in 1897? Yes, he did. And if I start messing with that, I suppose you could call it a framework, you could call it a scaffolding, a foundation. The architectural metaphors are the best ones. But after that, you're on your own. And after that, then you have the reader's absolutely clear that the dialogue, for example, could not be possibly for real. And what you're trying to do is create an illusion. It's a sort of total immersion idea. It's you embed the reader in the character by using a system called third-person intimate, where the character is he thought, everything the character notices, remembers, suffers, feels, is done in the third person. So if it's a first-person voice, you lose it as it's someone else speaking, not you. But if you do it like that and you build it, everything is from that point of view, no authorial interjections. The theory is that by about page 5, you should really have it where the reader becomes engaged, not just emotionally, but that you're embedded, you're in the mind of the person who is the he or the she. So that in a novel like, they say, The Master, you're constantly trying to bring the reader in closer to create the illusion that the reader is in the room or in the mind, so that's the idea. But you're working as a novelist. In other words, you're not footnoting, you're not saying, you don't have to give evidence. You have to show something that will bring the reader in closer. So it's a very particular system, but it is a fictional system essentially. Sorry, what?
Well, it's a really complex issue, isn't it? The line between, it's not just that it's a skill, but it's a real complexity when you're writing something that is overtly a novel, as opposed to something that is overtly non-fiction with footnotes or endnotes and whatever. Javier Cercas, some of you may have read, the famed Spanish writer, takes in many of his novels a true story and then introduces things that he has made up, and you never quite know.
Yeah, his is more sort of what if, isn't it?
It's not only what if. If you take Soldiers of Salamis, the characters are all real characters. Yeah. But a moment happens where there is eye contact between 2 of the characters, and the entire novel is constructed on that moment. Who knows where he got that from? But this becomes particularly acute. Right now, I don't know if you've been watching the television series Say Nothing, off the back of Patrick Radden Keefe's overtly non-fiction book, Say Nothing, on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where an act of killing that undoubtedly occurred and is the centerpiece of this book and Jean McConville, the story you'll know, in the Disney series, they ascribe responsibility to a particular person for the act of killing.
It's also in the book.
it's alluded to more in the book. It's not quite as blunt as it is in... So the book did not cause the family to bring legal proceedings. The book has caused the family to bring legal proceedings. What I'm getting at, I suppose, is in drawing that line, what are the limits of your rights as a novelist in taking something that is based on things that you have just said, I have to show that he had 6 kids or he lived in Rye or X, Y, or Z. What are the limits, if any, on what you can do as a novelist?
Let's see. The Thomas Mann novel is really a novel, I suppose, about what happened in Germany. That, in other words, Henry James was born in 1843 and died in 1916, which means, of course, that he lived in a time of peace relatively. In other words, that Thomas Mann is born in 1875 and he dies in 1955, meaning he has the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And I have a problem now because I won't write a novel. I can't. Won't is a funny word, but to try and write a novel about what happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945 would be, for me, very, very difficult to do. I don't feel entitled to do it. I feel that there's a great number of historians and journalists still have to work on that period. And I just would not, it would not be something I would enter into, I think. So that Thomas Mann is living, of course, in California for most of this time. I can work with his exile, but if I could not even contemplate working on about him, for example, if he had been incarcerated, I just wouldn't. It wouldn't be. I couldn't invent even a thought or a feeling. So as a novelist, I think I know what my rules are. The problem with the film, I don't know if it's about this film Say Nothing, is that there are huge geographical problems with the Disney, that you cannot make that journey in that time. And you cannot make the journey back, and you cannot make the journey back again in the time allotted that they suggest in the film and not in the book. So there is a real problem. And legally, it seems to me, speaking of libel, but the book, on the other hand, is a much more, Patrick Breton Keefe's book, Say Nothing, is a much more responsible space in that sense, that he does let you know how he knows and how he imagines he knows and how he's probably right. But the film takes liberties. I don't think you can do that.
Moment of real confession here. Boy, do your words make me anxious, because one of the writing projects I'm doing right now is precisely writing a novel about a lady evangelical Christian missionary incarcerated by Nazi Germany between 1940 and 1944. And I'm sitting here thinking, holy shit.
No. Hold on, I'm not making rules for you, I'm making rules for me. I mean, if you started making rules for, like, no novelist can touch this story, well, that would clearly be madness. No, I'm just saying from my perspective, I just can't do that.
Back at the front over here, and then let's take both the questions so that we can have one question over here, and if we could get the mic over here so that we can have then the follow-up question so they bombard you with.
Talking about films, I was wondering, how involved were you with the making of Brooklyn, and were you happy with the outcome?
Yeah. And let's just take the other one also, just so that you can... Oh, well, why don't you start with that, and let's get the microphone... Row 3 in the front.
Okay. Is there a third book, and does Eilish ever have a happy ending?
Well, I'll answer the first question first. In the film, Finola Dwyer was the producer. It was obviously Saoirse. It was John Crowley was the director, and me. So for all, say, the 4 of us, Finola's parents had left Ireland in the same year as Eilish to go to New Zealand. They'd lived their lives in New Zealand. Finola had come back from New Zealand to London as Irish New Zealand. Saoirse Ronan was born in America. Her parents were Irish. They took her back to Ireland. She was now living in London on her own for the first time. She was that age. John Crowley was from Cork, and he was living in London. And there was me. And Nick Hornby wasn't a part of this, but we made him an honorary, we gave him an honorary position as exile too. But I mean, there was a great deal at stake for us. It wasn't just an adventure story. It wasn't like Gladiator 9 or something. And I had no involvement. I wanted Nick Hornby to write the screenplay. He agreed to do so. I signed a contract, and Nick did not have an email address or a phone number for me, nor did I for him. So there was no contact at all when he wrote the first few drafts of the screenplay, which was exactly as it should have been. And when he showed it to me, there was just one word I wanted. It's about Irish usage. It was a small thing. And I just said, that's not what we would say. I went all national. And Nick made the change. And so the only thing, I came up to Montreal when they were shooting, and they put me in a costume. And just before Saoirse Ronan goes into America, Doofus here goes in just before her, wearing a cap. And so we got to know one another because there were so many takes of that tiny moment that we just had to spend our time falling around laughing over various things. And so it was an absolutely painless experience. And, it was, there were very exciting moments later when, it got up for all the Oscars and they realized that Nick Hornby wrote the screenplay. He got an Oscar nomination. He went in a red carpet. I went in lino as a novelist, and they put me at the back, which is sort of, the other question is, the problem is I don't have a clue. I just finished the book, but it isn't as though I know, I can see into the future what might happen. So I have no idea what to do about this. That I thought I'd finished the book, but seemingly it looks open. It's not meant to be open.
It's totally open.
Well, it's not meant to be. Speaking
we
of the death of the author, it's a great example of where the author is absolutely certain of something, and the reader goes, but I know more than you do about the ending of your own book.
We were a group of
Mr.
five.
Lawyer here.
We were a group of 5 who had just read it, and we debated for 3 hours in a small house in France what had actually happened. And there were disagreements between the male readers and the female readers. And people are nodding over here. You know exactly what I'm saying. We read it differently as between ourselves. And plainly, there's more to come. It's not blindingly obvious that there is more to come. You can't leave us hanging.
Look, stop it immediately. There is nothing more disgusting than a sequel to a sequel. And you can get away with it if you're Hilary Mantel, because you're dealing with the same period in history. You can get away with your Pat Barker in her trilogy about the First World War, but this is not such a thing. Think Godfather 1. Godfather 3 is an awful thing compared to Godfather 2, which is great. But you should. The idea that, what am I going to do? Dance to the music of time or something? A Proust? This is, anyway, what I'm saying is I haven't an idea in my head. I'm a free man.
I think we've reached the terrible hour, but there's quite a few hands. So just one more question. Just this lady here on row 4. Is there just a microphone? Are we allowed to give her a microphone, please? Thank you.
Yes, Colm, you've just told.
Can you speak very closely?
Okay. You've just told us what you don't think you will be working on. Could you tell us what you are working on? What your next book is about?
I've been. It's a funny process because you simply don't know what to do, and I tried something about a month ago, which is that tennis racket thing I told you about, and it's not working. So that's gone, I think, and I have a few beginnings from a few years ago. And one of them occurred to me recently that I could do that. But it's a few months where things like that will come and go, I hope. And eventually I'll settle into something. But at the moment, I don't know what it is. And but it's slightly frightening because, look, I'm going to be 70 next year, 70. And I have this sort of, moral character of a 9-year-old. And so therefore, I wonder if the brain cells are starting to give. Because they're meant to, they should. So, yeah, maybe I'm just finished. But I keep trying anyway and keep going and see what will happen. And, oh, dear,
What a glorious, glorious human being you are. Thank you so much, and the audience.